Welcome to the Samuele Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in. Welcome to a new episode of the show. Today, we are going to discuss the role of education and bringing sustainability in the academia. And we do it today with the Dean at the Prescott College and also the founder of the Regenerative Learning Network. I'm here today with Pavel Cenkl. Pavel, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope I pronounced correctly your surname. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Samuel. It's my pleasure. It's great to meet you and great to join you today.
And Pavel, you are not only an academic, a dean, and somebody in putting regenerative education and fostering the leaders of the future, but also you are an athlete. You have been an athlete, you have been an endurance, you have been into the Arctic. So before all of that and going to discuss your work, we usually ask our guests, what is your journey? How you have ended up being a sustainability leader?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, right? And it's always a question, where do you begin that story? And, I think, moving backwards, right, is sometimes helpful. So I've been at Prescott College here in Arizona for just over a year's time as academic dean. And I moved here, to the small, progressive, sort of ecologically and community-oriented college. We can talk a bit more about the focus of Prescott College from a similar university in the southwest of England, where I was head of Schumacher College for 4.5 years in Devon, in the Southwest. And a very different environment from Arizona, certainly. But the focus of the institution, similarly community-oriented, ecologically focused. All of the students participated in the cultivation of food and the preparation and cleaning and eating together, very much in a living and learning community model. And prior to that, I spent 13 years as various kinds of dean at Sterling College, which is a small undergraduate institution in northern Vermont. And I've been drawn to these small institutions principally because of their ability to, one, be flexible with respect to curriculum, and their real sort of authentic engagement of place, community, ecological systems thinking, and the work that's involved in fostering relationships in that community among students and staff and so on.
Fantastic. Yes. And your side of explorer side.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to add to that as well. So during that sort of academic journey, I've been an endurance athlete and endurance runner particularly, probably since the late 1980s. And, when it was not quite as popular a thing as it is today. And I've certainly, participated in organized events and races and things like that. But I'm much more interested in solo adventures, I guess, although that's a pretty loaded term that I don't really like to use, but solo experiences across particularly Arctic and subarctic landscapes. So I think it was in 2014 or 13, I started a project called Climate Run, which has its own website. And it's something that I've continued, since that time, running across Iceland over 3 days, running across Arctic Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, traveling to Svalbard, and running in various places where really the intent of it originally was to go and experience Arctic landscapes during climate change. And what's the impact of warming on glacial and periglacial landscapes and on local communities, on indigenous cultures, such as the Sami, and on flora and fauna. And it very much sort of morphed into a very personal engagement, as it must do, right? If you're by yourself in these landscapes, where it became a catalyst for me to be able to come back to, to various groups and to share those stories with, beautiful pictures of landscape, but talking about the relationship between the human and the more than human world, and where that boundary really becomes blurred, and where we can actually seek to engage in that alive space where the human and the more than human interact. And so based on that, I've actually developed both undergraduate and master's level programs in sort of trying to bring that into an embodied, practice-based academic context.
Fantastic. And the experience working and being together with nature and the creation, the fostering of the educational system. And I want to ask, we know that it's easier to change younger people than maybe adults, that they already stuck with the habits of the past. So which are the challenges, especially in our educational system, especially regarding the sustainability and fostering education
in education regenerative model and regenerative practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the key word, Samuel, that you touched on there is system. Right? And my professional work over the last several years has really begun to focus more and more on systems. It was, I think, as early as 2018, which is not that long ago, that I gave a presentation on using ecological models as ways to transform systems of education, both from a curricular perspective to organizational structures and governance models for education. And the more that we live into our present day and sort of the crisis that the educational systems are facing around the world, and I think, my expertise is mostly in higher education in the UK and in the United States, but I see that this resonates in different places in different areas, right? So I think that sort of a proliferation of universities and colleges closing, because of really a hostile economic, political, and sort of structural environment for small progressive institutions like the ones that I work at, and the sort of taking over of that field by large, sort of monolithic, institutionally focused, almost corporate, organizations, right? And when education becomes a business, which it, began to do, and this, one could argue where that began, but in the 70s, 80s, when the UK started charging tuition for its educational system and so on, and tuition fees rose dramatically in the United States during that time, right? I think we tend to lose, I think, the mission and the focus of what education really should be, which is about educating individuals to build a better society, to build a better civic engagement, a better relationship with the more than human world, with our neighbors, and so on. And I think some of the criticism that's been leveled quite vocally in the United States recently, in the sort of political system that we're in, I think some of that really has evolved over time, right? And I think now is potentially a watershed. I mean, it has to be a watershed moment for us to make some dramatic change in what higher education looks like and what that future might be. And I think for me, to answer your question about young people being the potential catalyst for more transformative change in sustainability and sustainability education and so on, I think that comes by creating an educational system which fosters that creativity and creates space for students to actually engage with these issues in a relational way rather than a transactional one.
I think it's very important because that is the model that puts, economy as the king without looking, or as, let me rephrase it, put everything else as an externality or something that is not important, while I think should be also all the way around. I mean, education is just about money. And how do you do it in practice? Because sometimes academic institution, we know they work in silos. There is they always publish research, and doing all that. There is a lot of barriers, and also glass ceilings that really protects in a way the status quo. So how can you share some examples from your experience how you are transforming that part?
Yeah, I think what's core to that transformation is experience. Right. And, I think what's foundational to the three institutions that I've worked at most recently, right, is that they are practice-led, experience-based, and that leads students to an entry to these larger issues, which, you might call them intellectual or academic or, contextual, I think is a better word for that. Right. So to understand their relationship with a particular place, environment, species, even to engage in dialogue, observation, active embodied engagement as an entry point to really understanding better, relationships in systems such as economic systems or, design systems or, any sort of food system, for instance. Some examples from Schumacher College, where I spent, the number of years before coming here to Arizona. Our master's students in a regenerative economics program, for example, might begin that course by doing some observation of ecological systems and sort of interspecies relationships on the campus. And then looking at, well, how do species interact with one another and what is the system and what observations might I be able to draw from that in terms of cooperation, competition, collaboration that then might actually inform when we begin reading and understanding economic models. How might we bring that observation to bear and really sort of the personal engagement with that, almost from a Goethean perspective in terms of sort of replicating the experiments firsthand, right? How that might manifest in a way that can help to underscore your understanding of these larger, more complex concepts, right? So for me, and coming back to Arizona here, right, where we have both an undergraduate on-campus program, we have master's programs, we have a PhD program in sustainability education, a large program in clinical counseling for Masters of Science program. And all of those, to varying degrees, because we balance on-campus programs with remote learning, are experiential and practice-led. Right? So our students, undergraduate students, for example, begin with a 21-day orientation program, which is very much engaged in community, in place, in activity, that then becomes the foundation for their ability to engage in some of these sort of more traditional academic concepts, right? So for me, again, the entry points to authentic engagement and transformation of the educational system is through experience, through the practice. And if you put that first, then I think it can help build bridges across political boundaries, across ideological boundaries, because shared experience is very often quite aligned. One other quick example is we have there's a small creek that runs through the middle of campus here. It's called Butte Creek. And we've gotten several grants to help support the creek restoration because we're in the middle of a residential neighborhood, and with everything that might happen in that, whether it's pollution or other sorts of impacts on the creek coming through campus. So we actually hold several public events that we invite the community to come and participate in, tree planting or invasive species eradication, or just understanding more about how this stretch of creek within Prescott, Arizona, could serve as a model for other community projects. And that, for me, is a great example of how experience, it's not formal education, it's not part of any sort of course, but it's something that the college believes is core to our mission. And it's something that invites people from the community in. So I think, again, making, secondary and post-secondary education accessible and available and visible with respect to civic engagement can, I think, really help to change what has become a bit isolated and siloed, as you described.
And thank you for that, because I really like how you are transforming education, which usually is more from just theoretical point of view, like memorizing theories or trying to be, or the conceptualization rather than the practice. It reminds me also of a lot of the work we do. For example, from my experience in Africa, putting farmers in the learning by doing classes, touching the soils, seeing how regenerative practices can really help and transform productivity without, hindering the environment. And on that, on really your work and the practical aspect, you have also a step a notch higher, creating the Regenerative Learning Network and sort of collaborative approach. Can you explain us why you did that and which are the objectives of these initiatives?
Yeah. So, regenerative learning is something as a concept that, I was very much engaged in at Schumacher College, and it's sort of a language and a framing that I brought with me here to Arizona, to Prescott College. And in that transition, helped to, found and currently direct a small, consultancy, is probably the best word for it, the Regenerative Learning Network. And really what that is at the moment, it serves as a catalyst to bring together different organizations that are working in the regenerative learning space. And, I was recently in Europe, in Denmark specifically, bringing together some colleagues from Germany and Denmark and Spain to talk about, how we might foster those collaborations in the regenerative learning arena in a European context, right? And for me, as much as I talked about here's the on the ground example and the hands in the soil, as you described it, experiential learning, for me, how do you extrapolate that into a network of organizations that can then help to foster that same engagement is absolutely core to my work, both at Prescott and outside it, right? So we've been developing here at Prescott, more and more collaborative relationships with organizations around the world, whether it's in, for example, we have field campuses in Kenya that we, collaboratively operate with the Maasai, just on the edge of the Masai Mara, which is, I think, near where you are. And we also have a field campus in Mexico, about 12 hours drive south of here, where we also work with the local communities, the local indigenous Comcat community. And, look at the intersections of cultural and ecological systems in those places. And we're also developing relationships with, universities and colleges in Ireland and Hungary and India and, various other countries through Central and South America and in Asia to build not just, opportunities for our students, which is absolutely key, but to really lean into this idea of a distributed learning network where the network itself is the educational model that brings strength to those individual institutions, right? We recognize that we're relatively small. We have about 860 students. So we can't compete, in some way with larger, state institutions or larger universities. But what we can do is build these flexible relationships where, building on collaboration and actually the relationality in the network, is absolutely core to the educational model, both for students and for faculty and staff research opportunities, exchange opportunities, and so on. So it's taking that ecological model that we use in the classroom and expanding it out to really looking at a global network that's relational, that's process-based, and really sort of cultivates the capacity to build resilience and to, build stronger relationships using really an ecological model.
And it's really interesting how these themes comes. We discuss with other guests like how we can use in economics, looking at the ecological modes, how we can reframe economics. Now we are looking at educational side. So it's a recurrent theme that's how nature is not only somewhere we live and in a matter way we have extracted and destroyed, but also now we are using as a teacher and how we can recreate a sort of more positive relation with our planet. And can you share a bit of your prediction and hopes for how you see the evolution of education? Because on one hand, we have this climate crisis, this pressing issue that sometimes create huge rifts. You can see, especially from where you are standing, United States now, it's no longer about facts, it's more about political or partisan ideological position rather than say, okay, how we can bring together and foster a better planet for everybody. And on the other side, we have the threat of AI, the technicality, the part that creation on an intelligence that for the first time can or will surpass human beings. So how education is responding, especially in a regenerative part, as a more sustainable one, is responding to two threats that are, I think, now emerging.
Yeah, well, that's not a small question, Samuel. And
I imagine we can even define speed.
Well, exactly. And I think there are more elements to that, right? There's the ecological and climate crisis. There's the AI challenge. There's social and economic crises. There's a political challenge. There's huge, deep divides, and all of these, are direct threats to a traditional educational model in a lot of ways, right? And I think a lot of institutions have taken on AI in various ways. For example, we'll look at that one maybe first. Just thinking about what role can that play, and particularly if in the enterprise sector, in the business world, there's businesses are leveraging AI to compete in the marketplace, right, and so on. So to not engage with that from a higher education perspective, depending upon the professions that your graduates are going into, could be could leave them less prepared, right, for that business world. However, if we think about what AI can do, which I think it can do very, very well, right? It can, help support student learning in terms of writing, in terms of maths, in terms of, coding and all of those elements, right? It's wonderful for brainstorming and for, doing some in-depth research and things like that. What it cannot necessarily do is what's core to the Prescott curriculum, which is engaging firsthand with place, with people in experience, in practice, assessing, using critical thinking skills to assess the viability of facts or of knowledge or of information, to facilitate groups in dialogue, to really do what's at the core of community and at the core of our relationship with the more than human world, right? So I think it actually creates an opportunity and a space for progressive education in the higher education sector to take on this mantle and say, all right, that's great. AI can do a lot of things, and we can use it in classrooms when we teach subjects that are appropriate to that. However, there's a lot that it cannot do, and that a place like Prescott and Schumacher and Sterling, right, are really well positioned to engage in. And I think if we look at the climate crisis or any number of these other challenges that we're facing, I, as an administrator in higher education, have to look at that as an opportunity, right? How can we, both prepare students appropriately to address some of these, really intractable, massive challenges? And then how can we as an institution, authentically engage with that in conversation as well, right? And I think a lot of what we've talked about already, sort of engaging community, in on the ground experiences, really giving students a deeper understanding of the relationship between them and the more than human world. I'll give you an example of, all the sort of running adventures or, the experiences that I've had to develop a master's program at Schumacher College that was titled Movement, Mind, and Ecology. And, that was a full master's program really focused on inhabiting that alive space between the human and the more than human through physical activity, whatever that might be, right? It doesn't have to be, endurance running. It can be yoga. It can be walking down the street. It can be various things specifically to train our graduates to facilitate those experiences for members of the public and members of the community so that they can use embodied practice to shift their relationship with the natural world that then might have an impact on their response to climate change issues, right? So to really build the depth of that relationship, whatever it might be, however small that might be. And this was born during COVID, right? So most people's relationship with the outside world was very limited at the time. Right. So with a single tree or with a field or with a hill, how you can use that relationship to then make change to your habits, your understanding of larger systemic issues such as climate change. So I think, again, the entry point is through experience, often through embodied practice, so that people begin to have this physical relationship with place that then they sort of understand a greater value in that relationship.
And thank you, Pavel, for that example and explanation. I think you touched a point that might also entice the curiosity of many of our listeners, since you have been also on endurance sports, you've done expedition and documenting also, the climate impacts and the world. So can you give us a brief, some examples, some stories from that, especially how the sports and endurance sport can also be a tool to create awareness and also, improve education, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the timeline for me is very interesting because I've been doing this endurance running, again, I think since the 1980s, right? And that has actually informed a lot of the academic framework, such as developing this master's program that I just talked about, developing a sequence of courses in applications of environmental philosophy when I was at Sterling College for undergraduates. And for me, it's that application of the philosophy, right? So at the end of that course, for example, of undergraduates, the students were developing these capstone projects, and they were really sort of amazing and creative engagements with place, with the more than human world, that really leveraged that idea of embodied practice, right? Because it focused on sort of movements and sort of the ideology of sort of ideas of movement that underpin some philosophical approaches, right? So one of the students, for example, developed an outdoor climbing structure out of trees that he had cut down in the local forest sustainably, and built this outside as part of the campus as his senior project for a philosophy course, right? So I thought that's an amazing sort of manifestation of those sorts of ideas, right? And all of that can really be traced back to at least in my personal experience, right? Some of those experiences that I had, one might describe in the middle of nowhere, which is never really true, but really far from other humans, in the midst of Arctic landscapes, in the mountains. I think of the Nordkalottleiden, which is a trail that I ran on the border of Arctic Norway and Sweden, through Sapmi, the Sami, homelands, right? Really, and I think I crossed the border about 20 times, back and forth and back and forth. In conditions which, although it was in August, conditions were more close to June. So lots of snow, lots of high water, very difficult, terrain to traverse. And, sometimes the trail was not even visible in a lot of places. And then, there were several moments, but, I can, identify the specific moment really, and maybe it was partly dehydration or, partly sort of lack of food, where I was probably about 40 kilometers from, what I would think is the nearest person, and having been probably about 65 kilometers into the run that day. And, in August, it's, light out quite late. So it was probably about 9 or 10 p.m. and the sun was cresting over the mountains. And I had to actually stop and think about, all right, I do feel this sense of the blurring of the boundary, sort of the vulnerability that I have put myself into, through this experience, whether it's through exhaustion or dehydration or what have you. And, I wanted to capture that moment, right? I actually in that space of looking at the mountains and the sun and the river and recognizing there was actually a river that I could not cross and had to think about how, either to wait it out until the next morning when the water would decline because of the snow melt was not as extreme in the morning as it was in the afternoon, which is what I ended up doing, or to retrace my steps, or really to make some significant decisions that would impact my physical well-being, right? So to be put in that sort of situation, I think compelled, this sense of vulnerability, right? And absolutely recognizing the sort of deep privilege that allows me to be in those sorts of situations, right? Sort of these manufactured situations of vulnerability that not many people have the privilege to access, right? So I wanted to come out of that thinking, all right, well, what is it that I learned from those moments that could actually be translated in a context that would be far more accessible and actually engage diversity of learners in relating to whether it's urban landscapes or suburban or rural landscapes, and engage in place that they could get to a similar understanding of the sort of interrelationships between the human and the more than human that I had to travel, hundreds of kilometers into the wilds of the Arctic to do. I don't suspect most people want to do that or could do that, but how can we make that accessible? And I think the sort of success of the master's program and the undergraduate programs that I taught, and really thinking about, how that pushed me in sort of an academic leadership role to really make experience and practice the foundation of learning, because recognizing that it's through whatever level of experience you have that gives you a much deeper and richer entry point into an academic context, as it did for me.
Fantastic, and thank you for sharing this also personal experience, and really, even touching. And when I was listening to you, I was like, wow. That situation, I really touched what you say, being at the boundary, and the blurring the boundary and the vulnerability, especially they also could help also, if I may say, also understand also the limits of the humans and also our place within the ecosystem, which we often forget, and we think that we can just be at the top and just destroy systems and ecosystem without, being instead of an organic and living part of them. And I think, Pavel, it's a wonderful episode. I would love to listen and talk to you more and more. And I'm sure it's something that it really often overlook areas, but so critical and so important. And as a last question, if you can leave a message to our audience that has been listening to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, Samuel, as well. I really appreciate the dialogue and wonderful questions. Thank you. For me, I've shifted my language over the last few years, right? From talking about sustainability, which I think is core to a lot of the conversations that you have with guests. And, we have programs that are called the, sustainability education here at Prescott, for example. But I've shifted that language to talking about regenerative structures and regenerative learning. And for me, if there's a message that, I keep repeating, it's that, we can no longer simply strive towards sustainability. Because my question there is, what is it that we're sustaining? Are we sustaining an unsustainable status quo? And in effect, what we need to be actively, desperately doing, urgently, right, is regenerating our relationships, both with the more than human world to rebuild, what the impacts that we've had that you talked about. And similarly with communities and with our neighbors, to regenerate those relationships that have become frayed and often quite divisive. So, for me, it's really an engagement and embrace and an understanding of what regenerative systems are like.
And thank you so much for this so actual and wonderful message. I think regeneration is the word that we need to put, and then really learning from nature in its way. Thank you so much, Pavel. It's been an honor and pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, Samuel. Really appreciated it.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.